Good morning, everyone, if you wouldn't mind finding your seats. So a couple of months ago, I was in my Prius stuck in traffic on the 10, and just like any good hipster, I was listening to KPFK, and the announcer said, "Spring is here. It's time to raise money for public radio." And what do you think the music was? You don't need three guesses. Bum, 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 ba-da-dum, ba-da. Oh my God, really? And so when we think of Vivaldi, the first thing we think about is music suited for any of the seasons, but we really think of who he was, who he actually was. Vivaldi was a priest, and he was rumored to have been born with a shock of red hair. And he was born on the day of an earthquake. And his mother was so grateful that they survived that she immediately committed her baby Antonio to the priesthood. And when he was ordained 25 years later, he was nicknamed Il Prete Rosso, the Red Priest, a virtuoso violinist. Now, Vivaldi became legendary in his time. Even Bach stole Vivaldi's concertos. But Antonio Vivaldi's venue was not the great concert hall. It was not the cathedral. It was not even the courts of the Esterházy or Vienna like Haydn and Mozart. No, this was Vivaldi's venue. It was an orphanage called L'Ospedale della Pietà. And Vivaldi was in Venice. Venice was a party town, and they had a carnival there, and 9 months after the carnival, there were a lot of new babies who didn't have families. And so at L'Ospedale della Pietà, there was this tiny window. This window was called a scaffetta, and it was a place where infants could be abandoned. And when these kids were old enough, they were handed an instrument, and they were placed under the tutelage of Maestro Vivaldi. When the boys were 15 years old, they had to leave. They had to join a guild in Venice, and they had to learn a trade. But the girls could stay, and the girls kept studying music with Vivaldi. So now imagine, reimagine, the ensembles that premiered the great works that end up on public radio 300 years later were premiered by ensembles of orphaned, abandoned teenage girls. They became some of the most respected and prominent musicians of their time. Now, about the same time that Vivaldi was making music in Venice, Spanish conquerors were settling down here in Southern California. And in fact, they named this city after the Queen of the Angels that had guided their journey across the American plains, La Reina de los Ángeles. And in the center of this city, they named a tract of land after the patron saint of wanderers, as they themselves had been wanderers. Now, I'll take a moment to tell the story of San Julian. How many in this room have been to San Julian Street in Los Angeles? It's walking distance from here. All right, so those of you hold your tongues for a moment. So San Julian's story is similar to the story of Oedipus, in the sense that Julian was born with a curse. And the curse was that he would one day murder his parents. And so as a very scared young man, he fled his home. And he lived with the wise men and the hermits in the forest, and he became an expert hunter and fisherman. And he married a beautiful woman, and they lived a simple life in the forest. And one day while hunting, Julian fired an arrow into a dark shape. And as he walked up to it, he was horrified to find that his arrow had pierced the hearts of his two parents who had come looking for him. And so Julian was cast out of society. And the legend says that him and his wife were forced to sleep on many a hard bed and bear many scornful words from passersby. But Julian built a shelter. And he offered the warmth of his home and his hearth to absolutely anyone without prejudice who needed shelter. And one day, while fishing on an icy cold lake in the dead of winter, Julian found this figure that was splashing around in the water and was drowning. And as he rowed over to this person, he found that this person was covered in festering wounds and boils and pustules. This person was a leper. He was someone whose society said was totally unworthy of being saved. And so Julian dragged him out. He brought him back to his home. His wife fed him every last scrap of food that they had. And because this man was writhing in pain and still hypothermic and shivering to death, Julian took off his own coat. And he literally embraced this man. And they fell asleep that way. And of course, the legend is that when they woke in the morning, the leper had disappeared, and in his stead was the angel that granted Julian his redemption. San Julian Street is the epicenter of the homeless capital of the United States. Tonight, 15 to 20,000 individuals will sleep not only on many a hard bed and not only bear many scornful words from passersby, at worst, they have to bear our apathy. An overwhelming majority of people who experience homelessness on Skid Row have some form of diagnosable mental illness. Perhaps most tragically, the fastest growing population of people homeless on Skid Row right now are vets coming back home from war. I was just at a Skid Row homeless shelter last week, and I was told that in 2013, the count of homeless veterans was 5,000. This year, it's 7,000, but in the meantime, 7,000 vets were housed. So there's something on the order of 7 new vets showing up every week. That's 1 a day at Skid Row-based homeless shelters. People experiencing homelessness and mental health issues on Skid Row often face the revolving door of mass incarceration, because the de facto treatment of mental illness in the United States is incarceration. But I can say that for myself, I have not met more brave or welcoming or courageous people than in the audiences I've encountered on Skid Row. Sometimes the most welcoming people are those whose homes might just be a chunk of sidewalk on San Julian Street, or whose homes might be a jail cell at what is effectively the country's largest psychiatric facility, Twin Towers Jail. So let me back up for a little bit. We're going to play this video a couple of times.
If you're careless and you make a mistake, you're going to bring down everyone.
Okay, we can watch that one more time.
If you're careless and you make a mistake, you're going to bring down everyone.
So that's me. I was on a show called Reading Rainbow when I was 8. And sometimes this is still the way I feel about playing an orchestra. Yeah, it gives you a little picture of the household I was growing up in. So this is the way often that we feel as young people playing music and playing an orchestra. And I remember I had a conductor of this pre-college chamber orchestra who was one of the first people that Leonard Bernstein ever hired. His name was Eugene Becker. And let's just say that he was a very, very strict man. But I was also very lucky to have this woman as a teacher. Her name was Louise Behrend. And in the 1940s, she started teaching at Juilliard, but she was one of the first people to ever say that she chose only to teach at Juilliard pre-college. She only wanted to teach young people. And so she came from an amazing lineage of teachers. This was her teacher. This man's name was Louis Persinger. And Louis Persinger was the teacher of this man who's holding the violin. That's Lord Yehudi Menuhin. And this is, that's me with the red bow tie that my mom forced on me. Lord Menuhin is teaching me how to play without a shoulder rest. And I had a friend look at this picture recently and say, you know, he's putting your hand over his heart. And this happened in a 2-hour session at the Sherry Netherlands Hotel in New York. My dad wrote a letter to Yehudi Menuhin saying that I really wanted to meet him, which meant that my dad really wanted to meet Yehudi Menuhin. And he spent 2 hours with me playing Mozart and Mendelssohn and talking to me. And it was one of the most gentle moments I had experienced making music thus far. This is Miss Behrend as I knew her. And she was one of the most remarkable teachers I ever had because she taught in stories. She taught in metaphors that I didn't understand. she would say that the articulation I had to use for a Mozart concerto had to be as sharp as the devil's tail. And I had no idea what that meant, but I caught myself 20 years later teaching my student exactly the same way that she taught me. I didn't forget that story. I spent about 2 years studying with her, and in that 2 years we did one piece. And that piece was Mozart's Fourth Violin Concerto. And we spent 3 months on the cadenza of the first movement. We spent the rest of the year on the first movement, and the next year on the second and third movement. It's a piece I played for my audition at Juilliard, my audition at Manhattan School, my audition at Yale, my audition for the LA Phil, and I'll keep playing it for the rest of my life because she immersed me in the story of this music. She taught me that music was about telling stories. Music was about communicating a greater message than just the technique and the virtuosity of yourself as an individual player. But we all know that training through conservatory, the cutthroat environment of trying to find a job in this competitive world, it takes the storytelling out of music. And we forget that the core of what we do is to communicate. And so somehow, sadly, I forgot this message as I grew up and as I went through conservatory and went through training. And I found myself in the LA Phil, and I learned about Skid Row, and I wanted to bring music to places like Skid Row. I had met a man named Nathaniel Ayers, who was the subject of a book and a movie called The Soloist. And Nathaniel was one of the first black men to ever study at Juilliard in the 1970s, but in his junior year, he experienced psychosis. And he ended up at a place like this. This is the Patton State Hospital in San Bernardino. And it's one of the last state hospitals with anyone who's incarcerated there has committed a serious crime due to a mental illness. I met Nathaniel over the course of several lessons at Walt Disney Concert Hall, but something started to feel wrong, that I was asking a homeless, mentally ill black man to push his shopping cart up Bunker Hill, 7 blocks to Walt Disney Concert Hall. It's not too different from what we do to our audiences. And so I started to go to Nathaniel. And I started to find that there was a beautiful thing happening in this trash-littered, crack pipe-littered courtyard on Skid Row. Somehow I was finding that story of music again. Now, before I talk about this place, the Patton Hospital, I want to say a word about asylums. Because asylums in our collective consciousness have this sort of feeling of American Horror Story and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, this kind of very eerie, sinister place. But in fact, the origin of the asylum was anything but. The asylum was created by the Quakers. And it was this place that was supposed to have beautiful, state-of-the-art architecture and horticulture, and in fact, they employed the leading theater troupes and musical ensembles to come and perform at these places. So people that were experiencing psychosis were surrounded by beauty on all sides, because beauty to these people was healing. And in fact, these performances were so good that the entire community at large would come to the asylum as a venue to listen to and experience great art. So my experience of visiting Patton was quite different. I played for 2 groups of inmates at the Patton State Hospital. One was for long-term inmates that had been there for 15 years or more, and the other was for more acutely mentally ill people who had allegedly committed a crime. I say allegedly because a lot of them were still waiting for a trial, and they had been there for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. They were the overflow of the Los Angeles criminal justice system. And so I went to Patton and I wanted to play some great music, and so I played the Chaconne by Johann Sebastian Bach, the great monument that a violinist can play. And I finished and I played and I poured my heart out and I left every note, out there in the audience. And afterward there was like a smattering of applause, And this black man in the middle of the audience, he stood up and he looked at me and he wasn't smiling, he wasn't clapping. And he said to me, "Son, do you know any songs that we know?" And the first thing I thought of was the Titanic theme song. And then immediately how there could not possibly be something worse to play in a state hospital than the Titanic theme song. And so I kind of demurred and I said, oh, next time. I did not know if there was going to be a next time. And he started singing to me. I'll never forget this. He sang an amazing gospel song, Jesus on the Main Line. Jesus is on the main line. Call him up and tell him what you want. If you want to get well, tell him what you want. If you're down and out and want to get out, tell him what you want. And suddenly in that moment, I was placed right back in the room of my teacher, Louise Barrett. Here was this man teaching me, this incarcerated man, teaching me the absolute soul of music. He was giving me the greatest gift I've ever received because it came with no expectation of return, and he gave me a piece of his soul. This is a picture from Los Angeles County Jail, another place that is in walking distance of here. Inspired by these events, inspired by meeting Nathaniel Ayers, I started a nonprofit organization called Symphony. It's dedicated to bringing music to people living in homelessness on Skid Row, to people who are incarcerated in the Los Angeles County jails. And when we started Street Symphony, I really thought this was musical outreach. We were humanitarians. We were kind of like Lady Bountiful with the fried chicken and coming to the people to bring culture and music to them. And so I started reaching out to various shelters and clinics, and I would say, I'm going to bring my colleagues from the LA Philharmonic, and we're going to play Beethoven's late quartets for you for free. And you're going to love it. And I didn't have too many return phone calls. And then I went to Skid Row, and I took my violin, and I played for social workers. And I told them what I wanted to do. And these social workers, many of whom had experienced a life of addiction or homelessness, these modern-day San Julians, reached into their pockets and they pulled out crumpled $5, $10, $20 bills, and they put it on a table because they were going to buy sandwiches and cookies and Cokes for their homeless, mentally ill clients to attend our concerts. 180 concerts ago and 4 years ago, that's where Street Symphony began. And about halfway through these concerts, about 2 years ago, something started to shift in us. Because we would play for groups of incarcerated women who would say, the face you make when you play, you remind me of my baby girl. And I gave birth to her while I was in prison, and sometimes I forget what her face looks like. And our hearts would break open. She would say to us, you did for us what the judge or the bail bondsman couldn't do. You got us out of here. And we started to realize that we had a lot in common with the audiences that we had distanced ourselves from. Because we would see the homeless man pushing a shopping cart on the side of the street talking to himself, and we would say, that could never be me. We would say, you are other. And because we want to reinforce that distinction, we create policies that criminalize that man. But in the jails, in the shelters, we would find that we were part of the same story. I brought in a piece, a string quartet by Robert Schumann. And Schumann has this beautiful quote. Schumann says, "To send light into the darkness of men's hearts, such is the duty of the artist." This is a really poignant quote because at that time, Schumann was hearing choirs of angels in his head. And 4 years later, he jumped off a bridge into the Rhine River, and he died in an asylum, diagnosed with something like schizophrenia 10 years later. And we brought in the Schumann quartet, and I took just 8 measures of the slow movement, and I played it for the audience. And in these measures, there's pain and angst and aggression and absolute total failure on Schumann's part. And I asked the audience how they felt. What did this music feel like or sound like? And I was expecting to hear, oh, that's real heavy, man. Or that sounds sad, or it sounds complicated. You know what I heard instead? One of the men said, you know what? That's the way I feel. And without blinking, without hesitating, I said to him, you know what? I feel like that some days too. And I had to do a double take because that fourth wall that constructed false fourth wall was being ripped away from us. We were not just illuminating the dark places in men's hearts, we were illuminating the dark places in our own hearts. We were finding that we needed this work. We thrived on it, and we were reconnected to our story. This is a man who obviously needs no introduction. This is Maestro Jose Antonio Abreu. I heard a story from a gentleman in this room recently who said that he had a student who was 7 years old, and he was coming to take lessons with him in part of the Sistema program. And the student said to him, Mr. Steve, you know, if I practice real hard and I work, can I come back and teach? Can I come back and teach here? And there's so much wisdom in that. Because what makes this program, the Sistema system, so novel and so beautiful and so powerful is that it was based in place. It was based in a story. And the story was so strong that generation after generation, kids came back home. They came back home to their community, and they came back home to teach. It's something that we're beginning to find in Street Symphony, is that as we root ourselves in the story of our community, as we find our alliances and our relationships outside our community, we begin to understand that the story becomes a principle. The story becomes a way in which we can approach our world. It informs everything. It informs how we program. It informs how we talk to our audiences. It informs the next steps for us as we scale as an organization, not across the nation, but how do we grow deep roots here in Los Angeles. I feel that we have an opportunity here to not only look at what the next steps for our multiple myriad organizations are, but to look at ways that we can create the next Louise Barrett, the ways that we can create the next Louis Persinger, the next Shinichi Suzuki, or the next Jose Antonio Abreu. People that continue to come home and people who continue to find their story. Thank you very much.